Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So today we're going to continuing series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 NANO project, and on today's video, FPGAs more specifically, because recently ElectronAsh showed some preliminary progress of trying to get a Dreamcast core started on FPGA. And before you go down below and leave a comment saying clickbait, go ahead and leave it anyway because the algorithm loves that blood. Feed it, please. But it is possible, and what I'm talking about in today's video is the technology behind it, as well as the fact that I love when people try new things. I don't think anything is impossible until it's proven otherwise, and I always think it's better to try and fail than to not try in the first place, because even if ElectronAsh never gets this 100% finished, the research and learnings he will glean through trying are going to help people in the future, because trust me, the MiSTer project does not end with the DE10 Nano. There's bigger FPGAs out there. They do come down in price now and again, and I am sure that in 5 years we'll be playing on a completely different device that may in fact allow for something like Dreamcast, but maybe outside chance this could be done on MiSTer with some caveats that I'll explain shortly. But you'll see here in these tweets, and I've talked to ElectronAsh personally, he is working on implementing some of the PowerVR2 in Verilog, which is a coding format that more goes towards FPGAs along with hardware description language than you would use something like C for maybe emulation in software. And you'll see here at least he has the menu running. Now this is still maybe 1/10 of 1% of what a Dreamcast would be. This does not mean you're going to be playing a game next month. It doesn't even mean you're going to be playing a game next year. It is all proof of concept work, and he is iterating through it, showing that he does have some polygons loading, although he's doing this in C still. And it is getting to look better. He's using that Z buffer in C code, but that taxi from Crazy Taxi is actually starting to look like a taxi right now. I love and celebrate work like this. It's always so much fun to see it happen in real time, to see people playing around with what is possible, because for the longest time, people thought PlayStation 1, Sega Saturn, and Nintendo 64 weren't possible on MiSTer. We have one core completely finished, one about like 80% of the way through, and the third one, Nintendo 64, maybe like 10 to 15%. Impossible is not impossible until you prove otherwise, and that's why I love these things. And big thanks to Pixel Cherry Ninja. He brought this to my attention. A link to his channel is below. We're friends. We chat all the time about MiSTer and video ideas. Go give him a sub. I love him. He deserves it. Do it for me, guys. But taking a look at the Dreamcast in and of itself, we need to talk about the specifications, the chipsets, what they do and what they handle to better understand how an FPGA implementation could come about in the first place. And my number one favorite thing about the Dreamcast is just how modular it is. Compared to the Sega Saturn, both in a teardown and from a silicon perspective, the Dreamcast is a very elegant system. First thing that probably won't pose much of a task is trying to get GD-ROM support in. It is basically just a pivot on the CD-ROM format. Power supply, doesn't matter. FPGAs, they have their own. Obviously joking there just a little bit because none of the cores from MiSTer require power supply outside of the DE10 Nano that you plug into the wall. But Sega did an amazing job with the Dreamcast in 1998 and 1999 in North America. Compared to the Sega Saturn, which was a mess of silicon, this is a very elegant design, and we need to get to the actual motherboard to talk about the chipset, what the chips do, and how that would be incorporated into FPGA. Underneath this little metal RF shield right here is the brains of the Dreamcast, and I love looking at it because it's such a small, concise, well-designed board from an engineering standpoint. You'll see we have the Hitachi SH4, we have the PowerVR chip, we've got some RAM, a BIOS, and basically nothing else whatsoever except some capacitors. And like I said earlier, that's in comparison to the Sega Saturn. One of the big development goals of Dreamcast was to make a streamlined, easy to develop for system, because the Sega Saturn always gave developers hell. Even when Sega themselves developed on it, sure, you can get something like Panzer Dragoon Saga, an absolutely incredible game, but it just took so much more work. So the real iterative design of Dreamcast was to make sure that the hardware was simple, it was cost effective, and it wasn't a disaster to develop for. But taking a look under the hood, we have the Hitachi SH4. Under that little cooling pad, we have the PowerVR chip. We've got some RAM. That's about it, but let's move this little cooling pad off so we can actually get a look at the processor. If you don't know already, the Saturn uses the SH2, and the SH4 is just going to be an iterative design on that. But compared to a lot of other boards from this era, this is such a concise board, and how it works is the PowerVR chip is not just doing the graphics, it handles a lot of the low-level I/O BIOS things such as that. The SH4 clearly just acting as a processor, running the code, and then you have some RAM over here, and you can actually double that RAM with some modifications. It's quite fun, and I may do that in the future. But this is what would go into making something like a Dreamcast core. Now, preliminarily, ElectronAsh has talked to some people, and he's theorizing it might be possible to have an external SH4 chip or some variant thereof on the GPIO pins for MiSTer. So maybe you'd use a digital top hat, and then you would just use one of the slots for RAM, the other one for that external chip. It would be very interesting to see if that's possible, and I love it from an engineering and design standpoint, the idea of adding on something to the MiSTer. We put the MIDI pi hats on there, we put stuff like snack adapters on there, not through the same port, but just building onto it. So why not? And obviously you can also emulate an SH4 core. He's talking about potentially using the ARM processor cores for that, and that would be more simple because we already have SH4 emulation. Demule exists, Flycast exists. Software emulation for the SH4 has been around for a very long time, and it is extremely mature. Just running Demule on my desktop here, you can see it's 100% good to go. And what I would love to see is the potential for something like NAOMI to be addressed, because a Dreamcast is not a very cumbersome system. A NAOMI is an absolute metric pain in the butt to hook up if you don't have an arcade cabinet. There's stuff everywhere, there's wires everywhere, you can't leave it out if you don't put it in a cabinet. And the NAOMI has so many amazing titles as well that I'm always talking about. Some of them came to North America, but some stuff like Asian Dynamite here, total Japanese exclusive and Chinese exclusive. And I would love to see NAOMI and FPGA as well, because net booting a NAOMI system requires so much hardware, so much money, so much time, and so many wires. Having it concise inside of an FPGA device would be an absolute dream come true. There's such a great library. We also have to talk about the fact that of course the Dreamcast and NAOMI support 31 kHz VGA, but at least for the Dreamcast you do need to have some sort of VGA box. This Toro box, 10 out of 10, highly recommend it, but it's still another thing we have to add into the mix. And what is VGA if you don't have a good VGA monitor to support it through? Dreamcast looks best on analog TVs. MiSTer FPGA does the best job of putting an analog signal onto a PVM or a CRT or a VGA monitor in my opinion, and I would just love to see something like this happen as well, and that would be still implemented in the main MiSTer system with all of the different video scaling options. MiSTer can do so much with analog video, and if we could get an FPGA core, it would be so much easier to deal with than those VGA boxes. But as we put the Dreamcast back together, let's talk about the possibilities of this. Like I said earlier, it's as likely as it's not possible that it is, and ElectronAsh has very specifically stated that as so. He's not out there doing a Babe Ruth pointing at the fence, calling his shot, saying it's going to happen. He is playing around and experimenting, but so much of that is fun. I love experimentation. Now, one of the limitations of the DE10 Nano is going to be just the value and number of the logic elements. It has 110,000. That is a hard number. When you run out of logic elements, you can't put anything else on the FPGA chip. But it's possible, theoretically, that you use those dual-core ARM Cortex-A9 processor cores to run the SH4 outside of FPGA. It would be a hybrid software-hardware emulation. And that would be kind of fun to see, to be entirely honest. Taking a look at the Dreamcast specs, you have the Hitachi SH4 running at 200 MHz with the PowerVR2 chip running at 100 MHz. It's always funny to see those low values compared to what we have now. And on the NAOMI, you're basically going to see basically the same values, but Sega was able to get 38% more power out of the NAOMI versus the Dreamcast. Now, like I said earlier, it's possible that this just won't fully fit onto something like the DE10 Nano. Now, I'm not saying that the MiSTer project's going to move to a $6,500 plus FPGA board. I'm just talking about the fact that FPGA developments still occur, and there are other chips out there that are going to have more logic. Now, this chip right here that was still launched in 2013, at the top end has over 1 million different logic elements on its highest iteration, and on its lowest it has 220,000, which would still be a 2x increase in the overall logic elements of MiSTer. So maybe ElectronAsh is going to pull it off on MiSTer. It is a very, very outside chance it happens. But FPGA development for retro gaming is going to march on past MiSTer. There's already people talking about what board they might want to use in 2 to 3 years, and some boards today that might be $1,500 may very well come down to that $300 to $400 mark as technology marches on. Everything that was expensive one day is going to be cheap the next day. But I can't wait to see how far he progresses with this. Maybe it'll never happen, maybe it'll happen next year, maybe it'll happen in 5 years, but I love when people try, and I hope one day we play Dreamcast and FPGA. That's what I got for you guys today. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.